I agreed to do this talk for Kat, and then I realized after I started it that about every topic that I was putting in here deserves a half-hour chunk of its own. So this is going to be really an overview of a lot of these major topics, but I'll give you the resources to find out more information about every one of these. So first I'm going to focus on the insect pests, and I'll just jump right in with peach twig borer. So this is a pest in almonds. You walnut guys can sit back for a moment. And peach twig borer is what we call both a direct pest and an indirect pest. So when we talk about direct pests in insects, these are the ones that are attacking your actual crops. So the insects that are in your nuts, navel orange worm, codling moth, peach twig borer, things like that. I'm going to focus on it today as its role as an indirect pest because in a young orchard, you don't have the nuts yet. So life cycle of this pest is it overwinters in what we call hibernaculum. This is not actually the hibernaculum. This here is the frass, or basically the insect poop, but we use fancy words in entomology. So this is the frass of the insect, and so it is bored down into this wood here and created a little top for itself. They overwinter there, and in the spring they crawl out. This is our twig borer larvae. They have a dark head, and that's one of the things that makes them recognizable. And what they will do in the spring is they will crawl down into the shoot, and you'll get what we call shoot strikes. So the tips of those shoots will die back. We then enter what we basically just have a repeating life cycle throughout the summer. So in California, they have 4 generations a year. After they feed in these shoots, they actually will bore down in here and make a little tunnel. They'll pupate out on the outside of it in like a bark crack or a tree crotch or anything like that. They will emerge as an adult. They'll lay eggs on the undersides of leaves and on twigs, and then they'll repeat that whole process over and over. Once you get into bearing trees, they will move into the hulls and into the nuts, but like I said, we're not going to focus on that right now. And after we've done several generations, in the winter they'll bore back down in, sort of into this pupal type stage and form this hibernacula again. So why we are concerned about these in young trees? Well, what happens is that these larvae, when they come out, can march right on up your twig. They'll chew off these buds, and you can basically have interference with the development of your tree structure. So here we have, actually, here's the hole that the peach twig borer larvae has tunneled down into the branch with. This one's going to take out this whole little shoot here, and here we have another shoot strike. So if you are monitoring in your first leaf trees after planting for shoot strikes, basically we're concerned with that very first generation of the peach twig borer. And so you're going to be out there in April looking for any flagging like this. Some of the IPM recommendations from the university recommend that you consider a May spray if you're getting about 4 strikes a tree, depending on how conservative or aggressive you feel like managing your orchard. That threshold might change a little bit if you're really concerned about the tree structure that you're seeing out there. Dormant monitoring is what you're going to do in the first dormant season of your orchard. And this is to catch that generation that is emerging in the second leaf of your tree that will then interfere with your secondary scaffold development. So what you're looking for in the crotches of, obviously at this stage, a 1-year-old wood, but as they get older it'll go up to 3 years, are the hibernacula. And it's kind of ridiculous to try and show these pictures. It's a little bit easier to see if you have an actual tree. But you're looking for those little frass tunnels that are sitting on the top here. And so I've circled them, and they're going to be in the crotches of the trees. They're kind of reddish. If you're finding these hibernacula regularly, that might be an instance where you choose to treat. All right, here's just some more photos. So here's some more limb crotches here, and here is the hibernacula, and there's another one right there. Okay, for the management, there's actually a lot of different options for controlling the peach twig borer during both the dormant season and during the actual spring. And like I said, I can't get into all of that because it's just too much of a topic. But if you go to this website here, ipm.ucdavis.edu, there will be a big screen on the front page with a whole bunch of giant boxes. Click the giant box that says agricultural pests, and it will bring up a whole list of crops. Select almond if you're interested in almonds, pick walnut if you want walnuts, pick any of the others if you happen to be growing something else. And what it's going to bring you to is a whole page of the different pests of almonds. So it's going to look like this. It's going to give you, here we have an emerging pest, the year-round IPM program, so how to scout for different insects and diseases at different times of the year. And then it'll actually, as you get down into here, have a category for each insect, mite, disease, nematode type problem that might be cropping up in your orchard. If you click on here, I clicked on peach twig borer, you'll get the information about it. So it'll give you life cycle, it'll be a lot of repetition of what I just gave you, it'll give you some of the damage. And then when you get down to the bottom, it's going to give you a whole list of treatment options. And what the IPM program does is they actually rank these in preference of sort of like the most, or like the least harsh material. So the ones that are less likely to have interference with natural enemies in your system, least likely to have environmental impacts like runoff, different components. They have some magical algorithm and it spits these out in this order. And then as you go through, it'll have timings for dormant or in-season sprays. It'll have your material, how much per acre, and then it'll actually have comments with there. So it might say this is really bad for bees. It might say this has a high potential for contamination in your water, so on and so forth. So this is really a fantastic resource for management options, for materials, for how to figure out how you might be interfering or impacting your system in any other way. So go there to find out some of this other information. We also have some other borers that will attack young trees. So walnuts, you get this beautiful butte-breasted beetle called the flat-headed borer. And in almonds, you get a couple more moths, the prune limb borer and the American plum borer. This happens to be the plum borer right here. Both of these, or actually all three of these pests, tend to focus on trees that have damage, and specifically sunburn damage. So the best way to control them is to prevent damage by sunburn. And the way that you're going to do that is when those trees go in the ground. Somebody may have already mentioned this earlier, I'm not sure. But you're going to paint the trees. So you're going to use a white latex interior paint. You're going to dilute it down about half and half, depending on the quality of the paint. If it's a high quality paint, you might be able to dilute a little more. If it's a low quality, maybe leave it a little bit stronger. And you're just going to paint from, the ground level all the way up to the scaffolds. And the idea here is that by preventing the sunburn, you're preventing this damaged wood that the beetles and the moths can take advantage of. And basically, you're preventing them from being able to get a foothold in the first place. Every now and again, almond trees do need a little bit of additional help for some reason. And like I said, these are all in the tree borer section of the IPM page. But if you're out there and you're seeing a lot of frass, again, the beetle or the moth poop, and then the gum balls, the big amber balls that almonds tend to do whenever they're unhappy. If you're seeing that, there are treatment options for about 6 week intervals you'll be looking at while the problem is continuing, and those are all in the pest management guidelines. All right, I'm going to move over to diseases because there's a lot of these and a lot of ways that you can get into trouble right off the bat, and then you'll be combating those for the rest of your orchard's life. Introduction to the disease triangle. Some of you have probably seen this, but it's really what you want to keep in mind when you're approaching the mindset of how do we manage diseases. So the idea is that you need 3 components to get a disease. You need your host to be present, in this case your tree, and some sort of susceptible condition for the tree. You need the environment to be right, so environmental conditions. For most pathogens, that tends to be water in some way, shape, or form. And then you need the presence of the pathogen. And usually in most of these systems, that's really easy. The pathogens are sort of everywhere. We talked a little bit, I know Joe mentioned pruning wound cankers. So these can affect both almonds and walnuts. The causal agents, there's a whole bunch. It's going to be Botrosphaeria, it's going to be Phytophthora, it can be Ceratocystis, it can be aerial Phytophthora. There's a whole host of different options that can cause these. In the almonds, like I said, you get these gum balls because that's what almonds like to do. And you can also get branch and scaffold death, both in almonds and the walnuts. And then you can also get the cankers. Pruning wound cankers. These are going to be cankers that are getting into pruning wounds, as the name implies. But we can also get trunk and crown cankers. So these might infect for other reasons, but these are going to be diseases that are affecting either the trunk, like band canker and almonds, or down in the crown that will eventually basically just kill off the tree. So these are Phytophthora cankers, and I think that's a walnut. These are both walnuts. Okay, back to our disease triangle. So we have our host, we have our almond tree, but you've also gone ahead and you've pruned it. So now you have this susceptible host with this pruning wound. Down here we have our environment. So Joe mentioned pruning in the winter, but being careful with water. Well, that's because the water is our environmental condition that can trigger this disease. And then lastly, you have to have the pathogen. And the pathogens, like I said, they just tend to be in the environment for most of these, and there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do about it. So what you want to do is break this triangle to eliminate the disease. And usually in most of these situations, it's going to be eliminating the link between the environment and your disease, or I'm sorry, and your host. So to prevent these canopy and trunk and crown cankers, don't prune before rain. We usually say before heavy rain, and we want to have ideally 2 weeks in between your pruning and that rain event. This tends to hold true for the prunus, especially the almonds. There's a big question right now about how long you need to wait for walnuts and Botrisphaeria, and we could talk about that later, but generally you want at least 2 weeks. You want to avoid large cuts when unnecessary. So trees are kind of like people in that if you have a large cut, it takes longer to heal than a small cut, just like if you have an arm chopped off, it takes longer to heal than if you got a paper cut. Okay, keep your irrigation water out of the canopy. So here on the left, we have a micro sprinkler that's right on this tree. If there's any sort of opening on that tree, you have the perfect condition right there for water and pathogen and host right there. This one I included, obviously this grower was doing some sort of frost protection, and so he had intended to get the water up in that canopy. But I'm including it to just have you get out there and think about where in the canopy your sprinklers are aiming. Because when that water's going around or it's moving, or depending on your irrigation type, water can be getting up in the canopy that you don't really realize, or you think, oh, it's not that much, but actually when you have that set running for hours and hours on end, you've got a lot of water up there. So you really want to watch where your irrigation water is going and keep it out of the canopy when you can. In the almonds, you want to avoid the wind cracks. We talked a little bit about how the training can set up the trees for susceptibility to these wind cracks. If you need to tie the trees, do that, because if you get these to start to pull apart, either with the weight of the tree or the wind, that's an opening for these diseases. All right, avoid over-irrigating and oversaturated ground. So for these crown pathogens like Phytophthora, their golden ticket into your tree is wet conditions. And if they're anaerobic over wet conditions, that is their opening to get in. For solid set systems, I like to try and see growers keep them below an 18-hour runtime to keep the soil around the crown from being too oversaturated. And lastly, just something to keep in mind is fungicides will not cure an infected tree. Once your tree looks like this, you cannot fix that. That tree will have that canker for the rest of its life, and that's going to impact the ability to move water and nutrients throughout the tree, and it's going to affect production, assuming you're even able to keep these scaffolds alive. So that's why prevention for the pruning wound cankers and for these trunk cankers is really your ticket to making this whole thing work. All right, I'm going to move on a little bit to crown gall. This is caused by a bacterium, Agrobacterium tumefaciens. We typically associate crown gall with walnuts, but almonds actually do get crown gall as well. They just tend to be more under the soil where you can't see them. The reason we're concerned about it is you can girdle your young roots, you can girdle the young trees, you get really ugly stuff that nobody wants to have their neighbors see when you're driving down the road. Okay, again, we're really looking at prevention. So some of this is actually your pre-plant practices, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to include pre-plant into a young orchard, but if you plant it right, you're going to be far ahead from the get-go. So what you want to use is something like Galtrol or Nordoc or a similar material on these roots before you put them in. And Galtrol is actually, it's another bacterium, so it acts as a biological control. And the biological control bacterium, it's another agrobacterium, actually infects the tree in the sense that it gets in all of those damaged roots and colonizes. but it is not pathogenic to the tree. So it colonizes the tree, it takes up all that available space, and so when you put it in the ground where it can be exposed to the crown gall bacterium, the crown gall has no place to infect because it's already been filled. So that's the basic idea behind it. And you want to make sure that you get something like that on there so that all of the wounds that come naturally just with the whole transplanting process are protected. Avoid injuries to roots when you're planting. Some of this is just good planting practices. Don't just jam the tree into the hole. And don't unnecessarily cut back your root system. So roots are something where size matters. We say, guys, it doesn't matter, but for roots it does. You want to keep the root system as large as possible going into the ground, and you do not need to balance the roots with the shoots. That's a total, I don't even know where that came from, but there's no rule that the root system needs to be the same size as what's above the ground. So keep it large, don't cut it way back. And then as you're going through and doing any other, say, cutting of suckers and things like that, make sure you disinfect your pruning shears as you're going along, and never, never, never put them on the ground and then cut something, because that bacterium is in the soil, and then now it's on your pruning shears, and then now you've introduced it to a wound on your plant. All right, if you need to treat this crown gall in your walnuts, this is a really labor-intensive process. You do not want to have to do this to your whole orchard, because it's 1 to 2 hours that you are spending per tree, and this is usually a couple guys of labor potentially. So you want to excavate, and I will say this is all written out in a very nice thing on the IPM page, so this is a brief overview of it. But you want to use either like a pneumatic or a water type excavation of the roots to expose your whole crown and see where all of the different galls are. So this one has been blown out. You can see the top of the root system here. You want to physically remove it. So get out there with your hammer and your chisel or your hatchet and just hack it apart. Get the whole gall off of there. Flame the edges. So that's what this photo is showing here. They're flaming around the edges of where this gall was. Or you can treat it with a bactericide. I think that's called Gall-X. And then you want to leave it uncovered for a year. So if you think about it, you just chopped this tree apart. The last thing you want to do with that fresh wound is cover it back up with soil. So you have to leave it open to try and make sure that you didn't reinfect it, and also to make sure that you remove the whole gall in the first place. So if you didn't get the whole gall out, you might need to go back and retreat it.